Misha here, and informally been kind of covering Kalashnikov development history with a little more added historical detail, new shooting clips and thoughts. We looked at the AK to AKM update, looked at the RPK in that series, and because I love you guys, and because I've been asking for support, I dug deep in the storage building and found a mostly full case of old Wolf 5.45x39 ammo. So, since I'm able to go out and run a few rounds through these again, something we used to be able to do with frequency back in the day and haven't been for several years now for reasons you understand. Yeah, we're going to talk about my Arsenal SLR 105A1 again, which is a dead ringer for a Soviet AK74, and really developed right at the same time and introduced just slightly after my representative of an AKS74 Arsenal SLR 104FR in plum. Yeah, I love these for what they were, and at one time they were actually quite affordable. And we're going to use them to talk about the switch from 7.62 to 39 to 5.45x39, how it was received, use in the Soviet-Afghan War for a decade in the 1980s. Really glad Russia has not ever gotten back into a hopeless war that cost them men, material, and resources for no gains, right? Glad they learned their lesson there. But this was a preeminent gun, and when I was a little kid, these were mysterious in America. It was new Russian tech and their new bullet that had all kinds of these myths about it you heard at gun shows, and it was rare to even see the ammo before 95, 96. And I bought my first gun, not this one, a Romanian, in 2002 or thereabouts. So yeah, we're going to talk about the switch, the transition, and service in the 1980s. Doing this because I know you guys love AK content. I can't do it every day. Not a lot of new AKs out there. But when I have something new to say, I will. So you keep supporting, I'll keep doing, and I'll even break out some of the special ammo for you now and again. Our story really does begin with ammunition, the cartridge. This should not surprise you because the original Kalashnikov story begins there too. In 1943, they developed 7.6241, which was evolved a few years later into 7.62x39 M43 we all know and love today. After the cartridge, then the series, the family, the light machine gun, what was kind of the submachine gun, which would be assault rifle, and the carbine, the SKS, were developed. Okay. And that was to kind of take inspiration from, obviously, the German 8mm cars, but also, I would add, the U.S. 30 caliber carbine, which is 7.6233. Either way, that was the newest and intermediate technology, and it worked throughout the 50s. But as the AK went from being a limited-use submachine gun type to when they kind of figured out what an assault rifle was, in both America and Russia, things changed, and the need for an intermediate cartridge changed. 7.62x39, it's a 30 caliber bullet, relatively low pressures and velocities. That had drop. It had benefits too, penetration and going through foliage, but it had a pretty rainbow trajectory, as Rob Ski would say. Issues, and they were finding in Russia the hit probability wasn't great. The same thing was happening in America and elsewhere, but of course they went the other direction through 08 7.62 NATO by basically just modernizing 30-06 and saying, that's an intermediate cartridge, right? But then America developed this. 223 Remington, which was an evolution of 222 Special. This came out by an Army program, which was, of course, supported by the Armalite AR-15 in the late 50s. And the benefit here, there's a lot. You get a flatter shooting. It's a small diameter, higher velocity cartridge, so there's more oomph that goes out faster. And because of its speed and shape, it's less susceptible to drop and wind drifting it. It's also just a lighter cartridge, and for that matter, a little cheaper to produce. It has benefits. In fact, the whole reason that the U.S. originally kind of commissioned and Armalite worked to make this was for use in what we would think of as a PDW. That would evolve into the AR-15 M16. And, it had its day in Vietnam, and that's a story for a different thing. But it's relevant here because by the early 60s, maybe even 1960, Russia had some of these cartridges. I mean, they could get it. And that got them to thinking about their own situation. They, too, were experiencing less than favorable hit probabilities. The original AK wasn't known for super great accuracy and automatic. The AKM was intentionally designed to address that, not to mention being lighter weight, and it did do better. But they knew they could do better, and this was the newest technology. I've joked in past videos that Russia seemed to like 223, which was what it was called, a 55-grain projectile. At that time, 5.56 NATO as a name would not appear till later. So they would start working with these, and they actually would set up a board, a commission, at the Central Institute for Research. They were ordered to develop a new small diameter, high velocity cartridge and a new family of small arms for it, namely a rifle and a light machine gun. So by the mid-60s, it's underway, and it's not really credited to one person. It's a whole team with lots of folks on board. And their very first efforts were actually, they just took a 7.62 39 cartridge and they necked it down to about 5.6mm. And those are the first experimental versions of 5.45 here. But they would quickly develop, 1966, 1967. And honestly, the 7 and 6 we all know, love, and wish we could still get, they really had the loading pretty well ironed out by 1968, 1970 at the latest, although it would not be officially adopted until 1974 because, well, they needed something to fire it through. This is Wolf 60 grain, what we'll be firing today. This is actually a commercial civilian loading meant for vermin hunting. The military loading was actually 53 grain, and it was essentially a mild steel penetrator originally with a tiny air pocket and then a lead plug in the back. It was meant to yaw a bit, but really that setup was done more to keep it stable in flight. The whole tumbling myth would grow later on through the Afghan war. It was a lacquered steel case, and it was a Burden Prime cartridge. Quite light, quite high velocity. According to research, they said that the 7.62 39 cartridge was doing about 725 meters per second muzzle, and they were hoping to hit 900 meters per second muzzle out of this, and they got close, about 875, 880, depending on what exact loading you're using and what period, but it definitely increased velocity. Of course, it's a much lighter projectile and a lighter weight bullet. With that said, with that established, in 1966, the same Central Institute put out a call to Russian industry to design a new rifle and light machine gun for this new cartridge, which they pretty much had the specs down. They kind of had to get that down before they could really tell manufacturers what to do. There would be some last-minute revisions, of course, just like with 7.62x39. But yeah, they knew what was going on. And lots of designs were considered, either on the drawing board or even tool room prototypes made. But already by 1969, 1970, it was down to two main competitors. Here we have the two rounds together. Lengthwise, they are very similar overall, with the Russian just being a slightly longer overall cartridge, but the casing itself is shorter, hence X45, X39. And the bullet taper is quite different. They're very similar, but also very different. Absolutely not interchangeable. In 1970, field testing and trials were underway with the two main competitors. Pre-productions were made. The main challenger was the Konstantinov SA006, which was an interesting creation. It used a balanced bolt, balanced recoil system, not unlike what we would see much later in the AK107-108. This was meant to try to check recoil in a much simpler way than the AN94, but still more complicated than the previous AKM, of course. And that just gets to the whole hit probability increasing, accuracy increasing thing. And it did quite well in the trials. Unfortunately for it, it was up against old-fashioned easy Bakelite. This is Wolf 60 grain, I believe. What's interesting about the way 5.45 shoots out of a relatively light gun, there's not much recoil or rise, but there's a certain kind of jolt or shudder. You definitely know you're not shooting a 22 LR. For a stamp gun, that is a very smooth bolt throw too. A design at the time known as the A3 from Izhevsk. It was nominally a Kalashnikov, and Mikhail Kalashnikov was, on paper, heading up the team. But in actuality, he was a figurehead, for one thing, 1970s, not exactly young. For another, he had his feelings about 5.45, about the switch to a small, it was kind of one of those okay boomer moments. He had his reasons, I get it. And there was definitely controversy in Russia at this time, before and after, about switching over, because you do have some trade-offs we'll talk about later. But overall, it was the future, and they more or less used his name. That's how the Soviets rolled. Same thing happened with Yuri Gagarin. And what the Kalashnikov team did for the AK3, they basically just rechambered the AKM for the new cartridge. It wasn't that hard to do. Now, production models would differ in more ways, especially as time would go on. We'll get there. But the earliest ones are very close, very similar to AKMs being made in 1971 and 72 at Izhevsk. And that is both a good and bad thing. Because it did mean that the new rifle was very parts compatible. Roughly half the parts, mostly small pins, springs, that kind of thing, were interchangeable with the AKM. Even the furniture was. Even though it would be different style furniture, it was interchangeable. That is a help. You also get the same manual of arms that Soviet troops have been using for 20 years. Reciprocating bolt, acceptable trigger, manual safety dust cover, the drill. That's also the downside, though. The Konstantinov gun was new. It actually really had great hit probability, all things considered. It was discovered to be perfectly mechanically reliable, and it was durable enough. It passed, but it was all new. It would have required setting up new production and a new manual of arms, new training for the soldiers. The A3, on the other hand, would only require a little bit of alteration of the tooling, all things considered, mostly things to do with like the barrel, the bolt, the trunnion, that kind of stuff. Troops already knew how to use it. I mean, really, the manual of arms is identical, with cleaning only slightly different because of the new muzzle device. Hit probability was still better than the AKM, and it was felt acceptable. And to be fair, as durable as the SA006 was, the A3 was even more so. It is a Kalashnikov system, so it inherited all that. So it brought over a lot of the good and a lot of the not so good from the AKM. But it was a developmental step forward. Keep in mind, this really wasn't to make an all-new rifle. It was to get a new rifle to shoot the all-new cartridge. And they had their desires their goals, and this met it. So in 1973, the commission, the board that was reviewing the field test, recommended to the State Ministry of Defense, the War Department essentially, go with the Kalashnikov design. Lots of reasons, some political, some practical. And in early 1974, it was accepted, along with finally adopting the 5.45x39 cartridge known as 7N6. This was adopted in the GRA designation as 6P20 for what it's worth. And it would have companions adopted right at the same time we'll talk about. Now there's no magazine in this, and that's a very critical component and a very recognizable component, one of two for the AK. So let's talk about it. Initially they used the same pouches as the AKM, and even very similar magazines. Now, this is the so-called Bakelite mag, and I'm sure you know it's an AG4 type material, phenolic type resin impregnated. It's Bakelite, really. It really is. It does have a steel frame, steel feed lips, steel lugs. Very durable mags. In some ways easier to produce, very reliable, not gonna, dent. It's either just gonna be good or not. Not really much to rust on it. It does save weight. Now, the bakes are a little heavier than later polymers, but it's still lighter than even the AKM rib steel. And it does have these little notches up here, because they did introduce a pretty neat new feature. So here, you can see that pocket and these loops for the gear. Left this clip empty because we don't really need more than two, each 15, to fill the mag. What's kind of nice is when there's nothing on the end, they're held in place. But the moment you put this on, it opens up. So it's best to set this on the back of your magazine first. Let me see how well this one wants to cooperate. You're dealing with polymer and production issues. There we go. They fit tight. You can put it there. And they lock on good. They put thought into this whole idea. So let's see how this goes for me. Here we go. It can only go on one end. This one's solid. This one's got a bump on it, so it's very easy to tell. It goes on there. There you go. Not too bad. This was canted forward a little bit the way I had it, so that's more on me than it. Did it there. Let's try. Tell you what, let's try it on one of the Bakelites here. The second one. Yeah, that slid on a lot better. Doesn't surprise me. The Bakelites are a little more forgiving or just worn. Seems to be straight. Some people can get really good at this. I am not one, never have been. For me, once you get them going though, they're fine. That last one's trying to bend over just on a little bit there. See? But again, I don't know how old these clips are, and I am not terribly practiced, but it gives you the idea of how this works. And of course, you could always just manually load them, and when you were done, you just put them back in your pouch here, because these were intended to be reused. They weren't expressly meant to be disposable. And this one's got its little pocket there, or at least it can. You can also put it on the side. And I just realized I've got a second one on this one, right there. So that's the place you can put it. Next one must have been out of my other pouch. Anyway, going to show you. Why didn't you tell me there's a second one there? I've got quite a few. A little ironic that I have an HS mag in the 105, because it's often been speculated that at least some of the components Bulgaria used in these were left over from the old Tula arms factory, although they're officially Bulgarian. So that's the magazine. That's one of the big recognizable features. The other one is this muzzle brake. And to be fair, it's a great muzzle brake. A little complicated. This one has an earlier zigzag. It is asymmetrically ported. It has a gas chamber. And then the brake works well. And it's on a new 24, not 14 thread pattern. And what they really did here that's also clever, it helps with accuracy by not being directly connected to the barrel, but also really repair replacement, because, you know, if your 14 mil threads got buggered up on your AKM, what do? Your barrel's kind of there. But on this is a sight block. The threads are on the block, along with your bayonet lug for that matter. If something gets damaged, pop it off. Pin on a new one. There you go. Still has a cleaning rod under the barrel. And on a military gun, there would be an accessory lug, as it's called here, typically used to mount an under-barrel grenade launcher, if anything at all. In practice, this is just kind of where the old lug was on the AKM, and it was just left over because why not? But occasionally it would be used. Another feature that you need to get a little closer in on is the famous 90-degree gas port. Now, the earliest concept guns and pre-production guns still had more or less a 45, but they went to this 90-degree to kind of cut back on bullet shearing. It just worked better with the new cartridge and higher velocities and the new smaller bore and all that. So that's pretty cool. Let's do our stripper loaded version out of 105. Nice reset. Very effective muzzle brake. And even though the butt plate doesn't have any cushion to it, like the original prototypes did, the corrugation does keep it from slipping off your shoulder. At least better than a straight, smooth one. Still works. We have the same tool adjustable front sight, and we have the same manually adjustable rear sight, regulated out to 1,000 meters with a battle setting. Pretty much the same as the AKM. Of course, they had to be recalibrated for the new cartridge. It shoots much flatter. And they use the same ribbed top cover. The early 74s and the late AKMs had the same. Of course, later on, there would be some changes. Same 1.0 stamped receiver, dimpled magwell, forged front trunnion, although by the time the AK74 came into production, most of your rear trunnions were cast in Russia, but that was fine. Of course, your bolt group, you have to have a smaller bolt head, all that stuff. But really, it's the same. When you see changes on the parts, A lot of it has to do with just production updates. For example, they did update the palm swells on the handguard to be a little more sharp. That was to grip it better, to help with recoil. Also, might have been a little easier to machine. The buttstock is interesting. These lightning cuts, I think they're cool. Good place to kind of grip it. It also was a very quick and easy way for soldiers to ID what they got their hands on. An older AKM or an older AK74. Keep in mind, it took time to transition. The butt plate was also different. AKMs typically had your, smooth butt plate with trapdoor. This has a trapdoor, but it's ribbed. Now, the earliest versions actually had a rubber recoil pad. The first ones, it was kind of thick, then they made a thin pad, but quite soon they just went to a steel plate, I guess figuring it just wasn't necessary, and maybe they had trouble with the rubber cracking in Russia's weather. You'll see lots of little changes like that. And of course, originally they would have the same kind of laminated Arctic birch furniture with the shell-like finish on it for the handguards and buttstock, but from the get-go, we were always using synthetic pistol grips of kind of a brownish color. Some factories would have plum ones too. And that's kind of it. I mean, it's enough to make it a new gun. It is. But they kept whatever they could, especially in the early productions in the 70s. And speaking of, it was adopted in 74. And right away, the order went out to both Izhevsk and Tula to tool up to manufacture. Obviously, Izhevsk would get going first because they had developed it. Tula would follow a short time later. Although in the 80s, they would kind of step back from AK74 production and focus on more specialty things like the AKS74U, the Krinkov as we know it in America. But they did make plenty of AK74s as well. Keep in mind, with the AKM, Tula maybe made 1/10 of total AKM production, with the Izhevsk doing the vast majority. After its adoption, the first few years, these were pretty mysterious. The U.S. tried to get what intelligence they could. Of course, this is post-Vietnam in the West. They were finally revealed to the public during the May Day parade celebration in Moscow. May Day is a big holiday in Russia because winter's finally fucking over, hopefully. Then again, here in Arkansas in October, I'm hoping that summer will be finally fucking over, hopefully. Anyway, so they were really ramping up production by this point. They'd kind of ironed out a lot of the early production burrs, we'll call it. And then, of course, in late 1979, Russia decides to intervene in Afghanistan, supporting the, honestly, puppet communist government there. And they still have plenty of AKMs in service. They're still switching over. But they have a good number of AK74s. And so, as videos and pictures come back from that war in the 1980s, we see these guns. In fact, it's quite famously known that when the film Red Dawn, the only one that really exists, in 1982 was filmed, they didn't have any AK-74s. So what they did is they took some Egyptian Mahdi AKMs, and they basically did what they could for the mag, and they put 74 look-alike brakes on them to replicate the thing. Again, that's kind of the two most recognizable features, especially from a distance, mag and brake. You get in closer, you notice other things like the furniture and gas block. Reciprocating charging handles. The trigger on this is also very nice for a stamped Kalashnikov. And the safety throw is pretty smooth. Yeah, they built these right, regardless if it's Bulgarian or Russian parts inside. We commonly identify the Bakelite mag with the 5.45 AK74. And while this is obviously a purpose-built mag for this caliber and gun, it actually goes back to 1968. The first ones were for the AKM, the 7.62-39, and they would keep making those really for about a decade until the AKM was taken out of production. So you will find both. But this is what made it famous. But it was only the first mag of several for the gun. Another hand-me-down component from the AKM that the 74 got was the 6H or 6X4 bayonet, really the AKM Type 2. This appeared around 1965 to address issues with the original, namely the pommel, but it also would go to a much better scabbard, really made out of the same type of AG4 Bakelite material as all that. Although, to be fair, by the 1970s, Russia would speed up production by going from forged hardware to cast, so there was a little bit of a change there. And of course, it was designed to fit this gun here, including on the muzzle brake. From Arsenal in Vegas, the SLR 105 came in 4 configurations. The standard SLR 105, SLR 105R, which had a side rail. I actually didn't want a side rail version. A lot of my guns have them. I really wanted just a bone stock AK74, so I was happy with that. And those were imported right before the assault weapons ban sunset. Now, all of them have to come in band compliant to the 89 ban, but the 94 ban was sunsetting September of 2004, which is right when this series was coming out. Thus, we also got the SLR 105A1 series and SLR 105A1R. You can kind of figure that out. Well, they still do not have an accessory lug here under the gas block because while we like to have them, they don't really do any good. What they would do, since it's a pretty easy job, they would replace the neutered front sight base with a standard Bulgarian one, pinning it on the barrel, giving us 24mm threads, muzzle brake. This one is a zigzag style. I put it on. And a bayonet lug right here. The lug would accommodate a standard late AKM or AK74 style. This one's an ish-esque. There we go. Any of them that have the smaller metal pommel should more or less fit, although it's AKs, so sometimes you don't get 100% cross compatibility. But the large synthetic pommel of the original AKM bayonet is too big to fit back here. Plus, some bayonets will impact right up here the muzzle brake in a way that it doesn't work. Most of them would, especially Russians. So same bayonet, you get a little bit more reach, a couple more inches, which actually does help this style of bayonet. It was a little short. And you know, after 10 years of the assault weapons ban, this look of just slapping a pokey thing on the end of your rifle, something we didn't really care about before 94 all that much, it became a statement and pretty dang cool. And it's definitely one of those things people ask, why do you need a bayonet lug? And the real thing is, why not? What does it hurt? Be honest with me, is this not one of the most attractive, at least Cold War looking firearm things you've ever seen, with the bayonet and the mag and the Russian gold green sling? I mean, this is it. This is peak. That's why I love the 105. I mean, just you don't do better in terms of historical, authentic reliability, the feel of the gun, everything works right. I mean, if you really wanted to nitpick, you could say it doesn't have the accessory lug, but I honestly don't care. I mean, it doesn't have the go fast feature, so it's never going to be 100% there anyway. But yeah, this to me was what I wanted for years, and even though I've had this gun for a decade, I'm still tickled with it, and always happy to get it out and shoot when I have ammo. During the first couple of years after adoption, production was pretty low rate, and it was pretty mysterious in the West. The CIA and others tried to get their hands on them, but finally, in a parade in November of 1977 to celebrate the revolution, the AK-74 was seen in the hands of airborne troops marching. It was still pretty hard to get information on it, but of course with the Afghanistan war coming up, more and more would come out. And yes, by 1979, the end of the year, Russia would intervene there to support a puppet communist regime government. And so they had a good number of AKMs and AKMS still in service. They were still switching over. But they also had a good number of AK-74s by that point, too. So more and more information came back, and some erroneous things like the whole bullet tumbling, the wound or whatever. I remember I was told, as a basically a young man, oh yeah, you could shoot someone in the say arm and it would come out their knee. I mean, there was some crazy, and they said that with a straight face. Again, it did have some yaw. It did have a little bit of tumble, but really that wasn't what it was designed for. And early 223s, especially out of the 1 in 14 twist barrel, they did too. But of course, design and development would continue after adoption. Let's give a shiny plum ishes mag a go. Helps. Chamber. Just enough. Well, it works. Here it is with a early polymer mag, the so-called shiny plum. And this one is a Tula. Tell by the star. This appeared by 1982-83 and is a pretty noticeable update to the design, but was far from the first. Actually, going back to 1973 with the pre-production batch, you had a run from that year to 75. These are very much AKM-inspired guns. They even use AKM furniture. They still have the 45-degree gas block. They have the earliest version of the muzzle brake, which is a single-piece half-moon style. Just a lot of leftover features. They don't even always have the accessory lug under the 45-degree block at this time. There you go. They have the original AKM-style rear trunnion. It wasn't until 1976 that really standard production was underway. The ones before, pretty low rate. And this first batch would be the ones that appeared with more specialized parts and furniture. They would switch over to the 90-degree gas block. I should mention that the earliest guns, they had that thick rubber butt plate. Then the next run, the first kind of production run, had a thin rubber butt plate. And this run would consist of about 250,000 guns. Most from Mishaco, but maybe a handful out of Tula by this point. But by 1978, we really start to get into full rate production. By now, we have true AK-74 furniture. We go to the longer forked reinforced rear trunnion. More and more changes go away because AKM production is now over. And while the first in this run definitely still had the half-moon single piece, the zigzag here appears as early as 1979, 1980. It's a little faster to produce, a little just better. It is chrome lined, by the way. The bore is also chrome lined. Yeah, these are the first ones that really do, and by the way, we've also gone away from the rubber butt plate entirely, but now it's just the ribbed steel. Still has the AG4 Bakelite mags, but then, of course, the war in Afghanistan kicks off, and then the full run's going, and in the run between 79 and 81, 82, they build 1.8 million from both Mishaco and Tula. So now they're both up and running, and finding other ways to streamline production. By this time, you see more parts being cast, not forged. Now, the bolt and the trunnion, the front one at least, are always going to be forged, but things like the rear trunnion, the sight base, and the other sight base, even the gas block, we're going to cast these now. Even the bolt carrier eventually would go to casting, but that's not till a little bit later on. They would also work with the top cover. It would change a bit. There's a lot of little details we could talk about, and it's towards the end of this run when the earliest brown plum mags appear, 82, 83, as I said. Some have more of a brown hue, to be frank with you, but plum's what we call them. And there's lots of theories about why they existed, but yeah, we'll get there in a minute. And Russia does start to export the design to some friendly nations too, namely East Germany and Bulgaria. But mostly they're making them for themselves because, well, they're in combat. Also, it's time to talk about this rifle's sister. The AK74 is adopted as the 6P20. But as I said, from the very get-go, there was a weapons family to replace existing 7.62x39 guns. This was adopted as the 6P21. Basically, at the exact same time, it was developed at the same time. The AKS74, the Arsenal SLR 104FR, as it happens here. Also officially nominally out of Bulgaria. Obviously a folding stock version to replace the AKMS. The front of the rifle is the same, except for some developmental changes that happened in the 1980s. No, all the magic is in the back here. And they did a bang-up job. It uses the same 1mm receiver. We have a different rear trunnion with an internal latch system. It's great. It locks up well. It's lightweight. The AKMS was heavier than the AKM. The AKS74 is lighter than the AK74. You're looking at about 6 3/4 for the fixed stock and 6.5 pounds for the folder, give or take furniture on it. It gives you, you save a little bit of weight. The overall length is identical. I should mention that the AK74 was slightly longer than the AKM thanks to the muzzle brake, about 37 inches. And with stock deployed, this is also 37 inches, but if you fold it up, you get to 27 inches. You save 10 inches, which matters a lot. This was designed, of course, for the VDV, the airborne paratroopers, guys in BMDs, the air-droppable armored vehicle. Also to be used by other air crews, like, say, helicopter drivers as a de facto PDW, and on the ground by some in convoys and that kind of things. Even police and military police and a few of the Russian naval marines had some of these. Just anyone who needed them. And really along the same time, the N variant was offered for both with a side rail. And this could be for night vision. They also basically ripped off the British Soot scope, calling it the 1P29. It was a 4-power day optic. Not as common. The Ns were a special variant, but they were around for both fixed and folders. And Russia is starting to field some optics in the late 70s and 80s, and it's worth just mentioning that. So those were all kind of adopted around the same time, and these appear at the same time. Now, production, as long as how long that would take, would never be as high, of course, for the folders as it would be for the fixed stock guns. But they would still make between 10% and 20% of the total production would be folders, just on who needed it, with the rest, 80, 90, being the fixed stockers. And I don't know about the end models. I don't think it was that many. It just, who needed them? It seems like in Afghanistan, when the war kicked off, Russia had over 100,000 troops there. At least 10, maybe 15,000 had folders. all told. But of course, there were other compact designs that could be used as a PDW, like the AKS74 U2, and some guys didn't need a rifle at all. They had a Makarov or an RPG. I digress, but it gives you the idea of the ratio. Because we do know that Russia made roughly 5 million of these before the fall of the Soviet Union. Of those, the bulk was, again, the AK-74, but at least 500,000, probably not quite 1 million, but maybe closer to it, were the AKS-74s. Sorry, I've never been able to find real numbers. There you go. And, of course, some were made for export to friendly nations like Bulgaria, and hence this gun here. All right. Very easy to reach in there and do for the damn time. And since this one's dressed in plum, this seemed like the appropriate magazine. Slightly less comfortable than the fixed stock just because of the hollowed out stamped folder, but it's really close. Yeah, it's very easy to fold back up if you need to. And I like how it kind of springs out on its own, and even after years it locks up tight. After both the AK-74 and AKS-74 had been in real combat, studies were conducted in Russia to see the results, if they'd hit their goals. And in short, they really had. Hit probability had gone up, and that was thanks to a faster, flatter shooting bullet. It was less susceptible to drop or windage drift in flight. They really liked that. They also really liked the fact that their soldiers could carry 1.5 times the number of rounds for the same weight cost as with 7.62x39, so they were hitting their targets more often, and they had more ammo. And the gun was just better, especially the folder, frankly. I mean, the AK-74, you could argue about AKM, but I think the AKS-74 is just superior to the AKMS. I should also mention that some NCOs wrangled themselves some folders they had done with the previous gun, and they did with this too, especially in Afghanistan as things went on. But there was still room for improvement, especially to speed up production and durability based on feedback, and this gun's a great example here of some of the changes made. Well, we've been using Mishaco mags. Let's switch it over to Tulas. And it's a plum shiny Tula. The rest, Kalashnikov Pokemon. Well, you know, it too works. For one, they would go to the so-called Type B top cover, also sometimes the lazy top cover. For another, they would kind of make the back of the charging handle more squared off just to make it stronger. They would also go to a new pattern of squared off mag catch. That's mostly just production things. The muzzle brake would change. Now this is a Bulgarian two-piece. Russia's two-piece is slightly different in the step area, but they did go from a single-piece design to a two-piece. Really to ease manufacturing. I don't know if it was a better brake, but it was easier to make. By the way, the 104 does have the accessory lug. And they would keep on with the brown plum mags. I should also mention that only Russia ever made true plum 74 mags, at least military ones. Bulgaria copied this style of mag, but they tend to be brown, brick red, etc. And Poland's were black. But of course, the big deal on this gun is the furniture, the plum furniture. This is Russian furniture, including this buttstock, which is an Mishaco stock. Tulas were a little different in the folds, and the Bulgarian stocks have a ribbed butt plate, whereas this is smooth. Keeping on. Another Tula mag, too. Yeah, still a very effective muzzle brake, but I'd say this one, for reasons, either the stock or the way the gas port was drilled, just a little bit more vibration, just a little bit more feel than the 105, but could be several causes for that. Nice gun, though. You get your plum mags a couple of years before your plum furniture comes in. Around 85, 86 is when this starts to appear. The pistol grip would go from that brownish Bakelite type to first a shiny polymer, kind of like the mag, and then a matte polymer, plum. The hand guards, and for that matter, buttstock, would also switch over. I don't have, of course, a fixed buttstock to show you. It's just like the wood. It has the lightning cuts, trapdoor, and all that stuff. It's just polymer. The hand guards, though, are a pretty good departure. We still have the palm swells. We have ribbing. The vents are gone from the upper. To be fair, they disappeared during the late production of the wood, too. And by this time, they're gone. This does have a stainless steel heat shield inside, for rather obvious reasons, because I like shooting 5.45. I really do. It absolutely heats up more than 7.62x39. Higher velocity, makes sense. I think it even heats up more than 223, at least most 223 loadings. You can argue with me on that, maybe I'm wrong, but it definitely heats up faster than 7.62x39. Pretty thin wall barrel. Of course, the flip side of that is, you know, it does cool relatively quickly. And we'll finish this mag off here. I'm leaving that. That's hilarious. I thought I had filled it up, and apparently I just did halfway on this one. I don't know if you can hear it. There's a fly that's been buzzing around me this whole time, and I want a little bit of credit for not being distracted, because it's not easy. Another fun thing that they did with the hand guards with the 74, really from the beginning, but you see it here, is they added springs to keep things kind of tight. You know, the AKMs, you can get kind of loose gas tubes. They added a big spring back here, and it really does help. It keeps these nice and tight, even after wear and tear. They also added a forked spring to the lower handguard, although this appears on some AKMs too, but it just keeps the furniture tighter than it would have been on the early AKM styles. As I mentioned earlier, on the fixed stock version, they went to a forked trunnion quite early on. This left side folder is on a 4.5mm hinge pin. That was the standard. And note that it will fold over the rail, but you do have to remove your optics when doing so. And there are a lot of other detail changes to the receiver, the trigger guard, the sight bases. I've done exhaustive videos just going over each part by part. I didn't feel like that was the purpose of this video. Check out my older videos for that, or if you really want, I can do an exhaustive list. But I'm just hanging out here at the cabin, you know, on the swing, going off memory, so you know, if I get some things wrong or misplace some dates, which I probably have, oopsie. They also get more and more specialized equipment for the 74 that it's available, including the pretty famous 4-cell pouch with the single hole, which is just meant for this style. They still keep 3 cells around too. So that's kind of where we're at midway through Afghanistan. And then in 1987, not the rifle, but the projectile, the bullet, gets an update as well. We're still using the original 7 and 6. It's just the basic round. There are some specialty rounds like tracers and blanks, of course. But in 87, they introduced the 7 and 6M for modernized. And essentially, what they do is they take that soft steel penetrator and they go to a hardened steel penetrator. That's meant to go through light body armor type stuff, or maybe just heavy clothing, just a little more oomph, because they've been fighting in the mountains and the high altitudes, just trying to get a little more out of the cartridge. It's hard to tell if you do have one of the M's, because they really didn't designate them on the rounds themselves. They just changed the penetrator. Of course, since 2014, the ATF hasn't allowed 7 and 6 to be imported anyway. Thanks, IO. If you don't know what I'm talking about, again, check out some of the older videos. That's one of the last big updates for the Afghanistan war in the AK74 series. Of course, the war would come to an end in 1989, and then the USSR would come to an end 2 years later in 1991, and that's really where the AK74, AKS74 story ends. Sort of. Some might say this color combo clashes. I say it's Soviet plum fantastic. And it goes quite quick. Really are nice guns. I've told the story many a time, but you know, Arsenal started importing these 2013, 2014. And I clearly remember back in 2015, 2016, it was a Black Friday sale. They were basically begging people to buy these retail for $1,000. And they weren't selling out immediately. People want 5.45 guns right up until they come on the market, and then they don't buy them. At least, you know, folks like me and you might buy a couple. We're not going to keep it running. Most people, when it comes to 5.45, they're all talk. Oh well, that's why imports have been pretty slow. There are more kit builds out there, Bulgarian kits, Polish kits. Unfortunately, not a lot of East German kits. I wish one day those would appear, especially now that the barrel ban is seemingly gone, although I'll believe it when it really sticks. Call me cynical. But the 104FR is really good as the AKS74, and they imported these in pretty good numbers. And it's a 1-to-1 clone copy of an AKS74N because it has the side rail. I have Russian plum on it. Cool. I've done a full video. I do not like the K-Var USA Arsenal plum furniture. Look, I'm blind and even I know it's the wrong color. It's like Barney Dinosaur. It also just has the wrong texture, the wrong feel. It's commercial furniture and you can tell. Yeah, side by side. Yeah, I'd rather just, if I'm going to do Arsenal furniture, I'd just do black. Now, to be fair, true black doesn't come quite yet. We're still a few years off from it. And that's in our next video anyway. You can always put wood on this or whatever. They still have a chrome-lined barrel. This has the original, what we really just think of as a 1 in 8 twist. It's actually like 1 in 7.8, something. They would speed that up after Afghanistan, getting to like a 1 in 6.5 something. That really doesn't apply to the full-length 16-inch barrel guns. It is more important with the 8 1/4 crink type barrels. Again, story kind of for another day, I think. Just thought I'd mention the twist rate thing. Bulgaria, even though we're just focusing on Russia, they got into these in the early 80s. They first just were given AK-74s from Russia. Then Russia would send over parts, and they would assemble them there. Then they would send over kind of raw forgings, and they would finish them in Bulgaria at Arsenal. And then finally, in the late 80s, Arsenal would make some. But by that time, the comm block's falling apart. By 1989, of course, the Berlin Wall comes down. I have my doubts how many Bulgarian, quote-unquote, AK-74s are actually 100% Bulgarian. I think if you scratch the surface of a lot of them, you will find Russian components, either complete ones or the steel originally came from Russia. If you get a Bulgarian kit and it has plum furniture, that is at least, yeah, theirs. Now, like I said, this is a Bulgarian-style brake. That is something they definitely did do, and they did do their own style of this stock. So there are definitely components they did, but Bulgaria very quickly got rid of stamped receivers. They never did the AKM, and by the 90s, they were back to milled receivers. It was a very brief window that they made not just 5.45 guns, but stamped guns for the military. The stamped for the civilian market, that's a whole other thing. But still cool. And really the only ones we got, because the only other big nation that had license to produce the 74, in other words, the TDP from Russia, was East Germany with the MPI M74. Did a video on those last year. Those aren't available in the country. Certainly not as straight imports, not even as parts kits. The parts kits that came in go for insane money. So that's not really a realistic option. And I hear you saying, what about the Poland, the Tanto, the WZ88? What about Romania, the PA86? Those weren't licensed copies. In fact, those were both developed domestically in those countries without support, without technical data from Russia. Not just the guns, but the 5.45 cartridges over there and the mags themselves. They're more based on the AKM. And I hear you saying, what about China and the Type 88? That's in a whole story too, because that was developed, I think, for North Korea. China never used 5.45 for themselves. They went their own direction with 5.8 eventually. Even it is basically just a rechambered Type 56, so it's even less sure. Yugoslavia never adopted 5.45 as a cartridge. They actually went 5.56 before that. And a lot of other nations never moved from 7.62x39. Egypt, Finland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, that's another one, but they never had an AK. Fun fact, yeah, Czechoslovakia never used the AK at all. And I could go on, but it gives you the idea. The AK74 production, especially the actual Russian pattern, we can only get them out of either Russia or Bulgaria. And of the two, well, we got these. And that's actually good, because they're pretty much perfect. With very little compromises except where they have to be for import. And I do think them being true imports is great as well. In Russia, production of the AK-74 would end by 1991 officially. Sort of. It would actually transition over. But these would serve even into the present day. It's still officially served. And of course, as the old wood furniture would wear out, they've replaced it with polymer. There's a lot of famous images of just crazy mixed matches of wood and polymer. They didn't care. That does kind of get me to the whole plum thing. There's some stories about it being low vis or some other. I don't think it was intentional. I think it was them trying to dye the furniture and the dye pellets they used. This is how it came out. It's fine. It's not gaudy or weird. I think it was just their early attempts at polymer. If it was low vis on night vision as a side result, cool. A lot of things are discovered by accident. But I think it was just Russia being Russia, Russian production, because you see mags and bayonets in that color too, and it just tells you that's the polymer they were using and the dye they were using, and mass production. Once it gets going, that's what they're doing in Russia. But yeah, a lot of these stay in service even through the present day. I mean, again, they made 5 million. But they weren't alone. The member of the family, the RPK74 in its folder, the RPKS74. I'm going to save that to the next part of the video, the next chapter. I think that's better. Just keep things moving on. But I hope you enjoyed this. I really enjoyed getting out, shooting these again. Really happy I found that wolf ammo. If you'd like to support the channel, you can always just do a super thanks on here, or you can check out Patreon. Or, if you want, just like, share, subscribe, comment, tell a buddy. That's kind of sharing, I suppose. Anything you can do is greatly helpful. Like I said, I've been trying to raise awareness, get things going, try to keep things going. And I know you guys love AK content. Again, if you have any questions, let me know. And if I got small details wrong just hanging out on the swing, I apologize. But I do my best with my memory. But I'm not exactly a spring chicken anymore. The old noggin sometimes fails. But they're really great guns, and I have been an owner of a 5.45 for almost 25 years now. So I've put a few rounds down range with these. It's almost all been wolf. I've tried other things like the bear ammo. We recently did the Tela ammo. Did Red Army Standard do some 5.45? I can't remember. 7.62 they have, I know. So I've tried most of what's available out there, including, of course, 7.6 surplus when that came around. These really got popular. The cartridge did around 2009. But then it waned, and then everyone, oh, it's not dead and everything. Look, it's a niche cartridge. It's a boutique cartridge. I wasn't really thinking it would ever catch on in a big way in America because it never caught on in a big way in the world. Is it better than 5.56? No. Is it equal? You could argue that, especially the newer loadings like 7 and 39 and 7 and 34. But not for us. That's in Russia, where we can, if you can get them. For here, with all the support and availability for 5.56, that's the way to go. They're both equally fun. And if you get an AK purpose-built for 5.56, like the Beryl or the Zastava M90, maybe one day an M21, please, they're as reliable too. It's your hack job conversions, Wasser 3, that just kind of give that a bad name, frankly. So 5.45 is cool. But I'm going to be honest with you. If I didn't already own these, had picked them up, frankly, on sale, both of them, would I buy them today? I'm not sure. Maybe. But I sure as hell wouldn't pay $3,000 or $4,000 for a 104 FR. That seems to be what people have kind of mentioned to me. Hey, this went for this crazy price on Gunbroker. Please stop doing that, guys. They're cool. They're not worth that. They're not. Just let the market die down. And there's a lot of them out there, at least, enough. Since 5.45 is going to get harder and harder to find with all the Russian situation, Ukraine war situation, don't worry about it. You'll find a good deal. Like I said, I picked this up on a sale when they were begging people to take them. But let me know what you think. There's a lot of good kit builds out there, too. Anyway, that's me for now. Very soon, I'll put up a continuation video, and you can guess what's coming next, I'm sure. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.